The air across southern Italy in 73 BC did not feel like the Mediterranean paradise described in poetry. It was thick. It was heavy. It carried a weight that had nothing to do with the summer heat. If you stood on a hill overlooking the rolling vineyards of Campania, you wouldn't smell the ripening grapes. You would smell the iron scent of fresh blood, the charcoal of burning estates, and the sweet, sickening odor of bloated corpses left to rot under the unforgiving sun. This was the new reality of the Roman Republic, a world where the ground itself seemed to be soaking in a permanent stain of violence. Now, picture yourself. You are a Roman senator. You are a man who has spent your entire life believing that the world was built for you. You own land. You own gold. Most importantly, you own people. You wake up in your villa, surrounded by the finest marble and the softest silks. But this morning, the silence is gone. It is replaced by a sound you never thought you would hear inside your own walls. The sound of screaming, not from a distant battlefield, but from your own kitchen, from your own hallways. The people you considered tools, the ones you barely acknowledged as human, are coming for you. And they are not coming to talk. Erase everything the movies ever taught you about this moment. Forget the image of the noble freedom fighter with a clean conscience and a stirring speech about liberty. That man did not exist. The man leading this nightmare was something far more terrifying. His name was Spartacus, and he was not a hero. He was a weapon that Rome itself had spent years sharpening inside the most savage training grounds the ancient world had ever built. Spartacus was baptized in the gore of the gladiatorial arena. He was a product of the ludus, a gladiator school where the walls literally sweated with the ghosts of dead men. Rome took a man, stripped away his history, his family, and his humanity, and replaced them with a single, mechanical instinct: destroy. They taught him how to open a throat with surgical precision. They taught him how to wait for the exact moment a guard looked away. They forged him in a cage, surrounded him with death, and then they were somehow shocked when the monster they created turned around and bit. What Spartacus unleashed across the Italian peninsula wasn't a simple rebellion. It was a systematic campaign of psychological devastation. He wasn't just running away. He was dismantling the very idea of Roman invincibility. Every time he crushed an elite Roman legion, every time he captured a seasoned commander and forced him to bleed in the dirt, the message grew louder. The image of Roman defeat began to travel. It didn't just reach the Senate halls. It reached the places Rome preferred to forget. It reached the dark sulfur mines. It reached the massive plantations where thousands worked in chains. The forgotten, the exploited, and the broken heard a truth that cracked their world open. The masters bleed just like we do. Spartacus didn't just gather slaves. He assembled an army of men who had already accepted that they were dead, and that made them impossible to stop. They seized Roman wagons, took Roman armor, and began to look less like runaways and more like an avalanche of iron. The hunters had become the hunted, and for the first time in generations, the heartbeat of Rome was stuttering with real, unfiltered fear. The nightmare had only just begun. Stay with us till the end for valuable insights. Like, subscribe, and share to support the channel. The fruit of Roman cruelty did not ripen in a palace. It ripened in the dark, cramped cells of a gladiator school in Capua. This was the ludus of Lentulus Batiatus. To the wealthy citizens of Rome, this place was a source of entertainment. To the men trapped inside, it was a factory designed to strip away their names and replace them with scars. The walls of the ludus did not just hold stone. They seemed to sweat with the accumulated misery of every man who had ever bled onto the sand. Imagine the air inside those cells. It was a permanent cocktail of human sweat, rotting infection, and cold, concentrated fury. You are packed into a space barely wide enough to stretch your arms. Your neighbors are Thracians, Gauls, and Germans, men who speak different languages but share the same death sentence. You are not being trained for a sport. You are being sculpted into a killing instrument for public amusement. Batiatus had a system. It was an assembly line. Men entered as prisoners of war, broken and humiliated. They were fed just enough to stay dangerous. They were beaten just enough to stay obedient. And every single day, they practiced the geometry of murder. They learned how to open a throat with a single, surgical flick of the wrist. They learned how to split a rib cage to reach the heart beneath. They learned how to put a blade through heavy armor at the exact angle that severs the artery. Rome was absolutely certain these animals were under control. They believed the iron gates and the armed guards were enough to contain the darkness they were creating. They were wrong. They were more wrong than they had ever been about anything in their history. Inside that cage of killers, Spartacus was doing more than just sharpening his blade. He was watching. He was counting. He was a man with the mind of a general who had been beaten into a corner. He watched the guards. He clocked their steps. He noted every shift change, every moment the sentries looked at the horizon instead of the cages. While other gladiators burned their rage in useless riots, Spartacus burned his into something far more lethal: patience. A riot is emotional. A riot is messy. A riot gets crushed by Roman discipline in minutes. Spartacus was not planning a riot. He was engineering a tactical breach. He began recruiting in whispers. He found men like Crixus and Enemos, fighters who had survived 100 battles and had already accepted that they would never see their homes again. They spoke the universal language of men who have nothing left to lose. The breakout didn't happen with a noble speech. It happened with a kitchen knife. When the plan was leaked and the Roman guards moved to purge the cells, the timeline collapsed. It was now or never. The gladiators had no swords. They had no shields. The army was locked behind iron doors. So they pivoted with the instinct of predators. They stormed the kitchen. They grabbed heavy iron cooking spits. They seized cleavers designed to split cattle bones. They took pots of boiling oil. The first Roman guard who stepped through the door expecting a minor disturbance never saw the sun set. A rusted iron spit was punched clean through his neck, nailing him to the wooden frame behind him. In that one act of violence, the illusion of Roman ownership died. The idea that these men were property evaporated on that blood-stained kitchen floor. They poured out of the ludus like floodwater through a broken dam. They were 70 men drenched in Roman blood, standing in the open streets of Capua for the first time in years. They weren't just free. They were armed, and they were looking for a war. Freedom is a heavy thing when you have nowhere to go. After the blood on the kitchen floor in Capua, the 70 gladiators were no longer property, but they weren't yet an army. They were targets. The Roman war machine was slow, but once it started moving, it moved with the weight of an avalanche. Spartacus knew this. He understood that a group of men standing in a city street, drenched in blood, would be cut down in hours if they didn't find a way to change the game. But then, luck, or perhaps destiny, hit them in the form of a supply wagon. Imagine the scene: a heavy wooden cat, bound for another gladiator school, filled to the brim with military-grade weapons. polished breastplates, heavy oak shields, forged steel swords. The gladiators threw their kitchen spits and meat cleavers into the dirt. They buckled on the leather and iron. They were shedding the skin of the arena and putting on the skin of the soldier. They weren't just survivors anymore. They were becoming a professional killing force. Spartacus looked at the horizon and saw his fortress, Mount Vesuvius. In 73 BC, Vesuvius was not the famous destroyer it would one day become. It was silent. It was overgrown. It was a jagged, green giant cloaked in wild vines and vertical cliffs. To a normal general, it was a logistical nightmare. To a man with nothing left to lose, it was a sanctuary designed by nature. They climbed. They scaled the brutal rock faces until they reached the summit. They waited. Rome's response was wrapped in pure, toxic arrogance. When the news of the Capua breakout reached the Senate, the reaction wasn't fear. It was annoyance. To the elite, 70 escaped slaves were a police matter, not a war. They didn't send their best legions. They didn't send their famous generals. They sent a politician named Gaius Claudius Glaber and 3,000 men who were barely more than farmers with sticks. Now, picture yourself in Glaber's camp at the base of the mountain. You look up at the sheer cliffs of Vesuvius and you laugh. There is only one narrow path leading down from the top. You block it. You pitch your tents. You light your fires and pour your wine. Why waste Roman lives attacking? You just have to wait. Starvation is a patient killer. You believe the animals at the top are trapped. You believe they are dying of thirst. You believe you have already won. You have never been more wrong. On the summit, the air was freezing. The gladiators' bellies were cramped with hunger. Some men talked about a suicidal charge down the main path, a quick death on Roman steel. But Spartacus was looking at the edge of the cliff. He was looking at the wild grapevines that grew thick and stubborn over the rim of the caldera. Something clicked in his mind. He didn't order a charge. He ordered a harvest. Working in total, calculated silence beneath a moonless sky, the gladiators cut the vines. They braided them into massive, heavy ropes. They tested every knot. One by one, they anchored the ropes to the trees at the cliff's edge. Spartacus was the first. Imagine the sensation, stepping backward into a black void, gripping a vine rope, sliding down a vertical rock face that Rome had declared impossible to descend. One slip meant a fall that would scatter your bones across the rocks below. But 70 men followed him. They descended through the dak, invisible and silent. They hit the ground behind the Roman lines. Glaber's camp was facing the mountain, staring at the path, waiting for a surrender that would never come. They never looked behind them. The night split open with a roar that felt like the mountain itself was screaming. The gladiators crashed into the rear of the camp like an avalanche of iron and rage. There were no formations. There was only slaughter. Men were killed in their sleep. Men were killed reaching for swords they would never touch. Tents exploded into flame. Glaber, the proud Roman commander, did the only thing he could. He ran. He abandoned his men, his honor, and his camp, disappearing into the night like a common thief. Spartacus stood in the wreckage of the camp, soaked in the blood of the men who had called themselves his masters. He had not just beaten a Roman force. He had humiliated the Republic. He seized their gold. He seized their food. Most importantly, he seized their weapons. The news of Vesuvius didn't just travel. It burned through Italy like a wildfire. And in the dark corners of the empire, the people in chains began to look at their own masters and smile. By the early months of 72 BC, the spark that started in a kitchen in Capua had become a continental inferno. Spartacus was no longer leading a band of 70 fugitives. He was the sun around which an entire solar system of the oppressed revolved. The camp at the base of Vesuvius had swollen into a sprawling, chaotic city of the dispossessed. 40,000 human beings, then 70,000. It was a mobile nation of the damned, held together by a shared hatred of the eagle of Rome. Imagine the sound of that camp. It wasn't the disciplined silence of a Roman legion. It was a cacophony. You would hear the clanging of improvised anvils as stolen iron was hammered into spearheads. You would hear a dozen different languages, Thracian, Gaulish, German, Greek, all arguing over the same stolen meat. You would see former plantation workers, their backs still crisscrossed with the scars of the lash, now standing tall with Roman shields on their arms. They were drunk on their own victories. They looked at the burning Roman estates and believed the Republic was already dead. But Spartacus was not drunk. He was stone-cold sober. He stood on the ridgelines, watching the ocean of torchlight stretch to the horizon, and he saw the truth that his men refused to acknowledge. Rome was not a single beast you could kill with one strike. It was a Hydra. He had severed the heads nearest to him, the politicians, the militia commanders, the arrogant praetors, but the real monsters were still overseas. The professional, battle-hardened legions were fighting wars in Spain and the East. The moment those veterans set foot back on Italian soil, his 70,000 untrained rebels would be fed into a meat grinder with mechanical, industrial precision. He had a plan, a rational, strategic withdrawal. March north, smash through whatever stood in the way, and cross the Alps. Once over those frozen peaks, the army would scatter. Every man would return to his homeland, disappearing into the forests of Gaul and Germany where Rome could never reach them. It was a plan for survival. But an army forged in rage does not respond to logic. It responds to blood. Crassus, the massive, battle-scarred Gaul who had bled beside Spartacus from the beginning, saw the world differently. He didn't want to flee into a frozen forest. He looked at the wine flowing in the captured villas, the piles of Roman gold, and the road to Rome itself lying wide open. He wanted to watch the Republic choke on its own ashes. The argument inside the command tent turned vicious. Two predators, forged in the same arena, were now pointing their blades at each other. Neither would bend. In the spring, the fracture became a reality. Crassus took 30,000 Gauls and Germans and marched south, fueled by a hunger for vengeance that blinded him to the mathematics of war. Spartacus watched them go in silence. He didn't plead. He knew exactly what was coming. Rome had finally stopped laughing. The Senate had reclassified the slave disturbance as an existential threat. They activated the highest tier of military authority. They sent 2 newly elected consuls and full consular legions, the iron-disciplined war machine that had conquered half the known world. The sound of their boots striking the paved Roman roads in perfect unison was the sound of a civilization deciding that something needed to die. The consul Gellus found Crassus first. The Gaulish army was easy to track. They were bloated with stolen silver and heavy wine, leaving a trail of smoke and chaos that a blind man could follow. The collision near Mount Garganus was not a battle, it was a slaughter. The Roman legions didn't roar. They didn't beat their chests. They simply locked their shields into a solid, breathing wall of steel and began the mechanical rhythm. Step, thrust. Step, thrust. The Gauls threw themselves at the line with berserker fury, but courage does not defeat engineering. 30,000 rebels were systematically processed into human meat. Crassus died on the front line, his head severed and raised on a spear for the Roman army to see. When the news reached Spartacus, he didn't mourn with tears. He reacted with a psychological counterstrike so savage it would paralyze the Senate with terror. He captured 300 Roman prisoners, soldiers and aristocrats. He built a crude wooden arena in a field and forced them to do exactly what they had forced him to do. He handed them rusted blades and told them to fight to the death. The masters became the entertainment. The world flipped on its axis as the slaves watched the gods of Rome weep and stab each other in the dirt. It was a funeral tribute for Crassus, and it was a message to the Republic: the rules have changed. The winter of 71 BC was not just a season, it was a physical weight. On one side of the 37-mile wall stood Marcus Crassus, a man who had turned the Roman army into a machine of cold, calculated terror. On the other side, trapped in the toe of Italy, was Spartacus and a starving nation of 120,000 souls. The merchant of death had done what no general could. He had stopped the momentum. He had replaced the battlefield with a cage. But Spartacus was not a man who died in a cage. He had escaped the looters of Capua with a kitchen spit. He was not going to let a ditch in the dirt be his end. On a night when the snow fell so thick it blinded the Roman sentries, Spartacus struck. He didn't use a massive charge. He used the bodies of the dead. He ordered his men to fill a section of the Roman ditch with the carcasses of horses and fallen soldiers, creating a bridge of flesh and earth. Under the cover of the howling wind, the rebel army poured over the wall. They were out. They were back in the open. But the air felt different now. The hunt was no longer a game. Crassus was coming, and he wasn't alone. The Senate, smelling blood, had recalled the great Pompey from Spain and Lucullus from the east. The giants of Rome were closing in from every direction. Spartacus knew the mathematics. If these three forces converged, there would be no survivors. He turned his army north, a desperate, final sprint for the mountains. But the rot of victory had returned. His commanders argued. His men, exhausted and hungry, began to splinter. A large group of Gauls and Germans broke away, believing they could stand alone. Crassus caught them and slaughtered 12,000 of them in a single afternoon. The end came at the Silurius River. Spartacus realized there was no more running. The trap was closed. He looked at his horse, a fine Roman stallion, and drew his sword. In front of his entire army, he killed the animal. He told his men, "If we win, I will have many better horses. If we lose, I will not need one." It was the final act of a man who had already accepted death. The battle was not a tactical masterpiece. It was a chaotic, screaming collision of two worlds. Spartacus fought like a demon, trying to cut his way through the Roman ranks to reach Crassus himself. He wanted to kill the man who had bought his war. He slew 2 centurions. He was wounded in the thigh by a spear, but he sank to his knee, holding his shield before him, and continued to hack at the legs of the Roman legionaries until he was overwhelmed. He was never found. No body, no grave, no monument. Spartacus simply vanished into the red mud of the battlefield, becoming a ghost that would haunt the Roman imagination for 1,000 years. But Crassus wanted more than a victory. He wanted a lesson. He took 6,000 survivors of the rebel army, men who had dreamed of a world without chains, and he marched them to the Appian Way, the great road leading straight into the heart of Rome. He didn't execute them quickly. He lined the road for 200 miles with wooden crosses. Imagine walking that road. For days, the only thing you would see is a forest of human agony. 6,000 men nailed to timber, left to scream, then to moan, and finally to rot under the Italian sun. Every traveler, every merchant, and every slave entering the city had to walk through that corridor of death. It was the Republic's final statement. They wanted the world to know that they could be beaten, they could be terrified, and they could be humiliated. But in the end, the machine always wins. The crosses eventually fell. The bones turned to dust. But the name of the man who made the masters tremble remained. Rome built the monster, and for one brief, blood-soaked moment, the monster almost tore the heart out of the world. If you enjoy dark, untold history, subscribe because we uncover what others won't.